John Carson's blood turned to ice as the outlaw's ultimatum pierced the air. Your land or your daughter, choose now. The knife in his hand suddenly felt like an extension of his fury as the silent mountain man prepared to show exactly what happened to men who threatened his child. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard of the Carson homestead. Martha Carson stood on the porch, one hand shielding her eyes from the glare, the other clutching her daughter Emma tightly to her side. The girl, barely 8 years old, trembled against her mother's skirts as they watched the three riders approach. Martha recognized the lead man immediately, Silas Blackwood, the cattle baron who had been trying to buy their land for the past year. The other two were strangers to her, hard-faced men with guns strapped to their hips. The third rider, trailing slightly behind, was Different Cloud, a Lakota scout who sometimes worked for the white settlers. His presence surprised her. "John," Martha called over her shoulder, her voice tight with fear. "They're coming." Inside the cabin, John Carson reached for his rifle, checking that it was loaded before moving to join his wife and daughter. At 35, John had the weathered look of a man who had spent his life fighting the elements. His hands were calloused from years of working the land, building something from nothing in this harsh territory. The small homestead represented everything they had, every hope, every dream, every drop of sweat. "Take Emma inside," he said quietly as he stepped onto the porch. Martha hesitated, unwilling to leave him alone to face what was coming. "Please, Martha, I don't want her to see this." The approaching riders slowed as they neared the cabin, dust billowing around their horses' hooves. Silas Blackwood sat tall in his saddle, a man accustomed to getting his way. His expensive clothes and well-groomed appearance stood in stark contrast to the rough simplicity of the Carson homestead. "Morning, Carson," Blackwood called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Thought I'd pay you a friendly visit." John's grip tightened on his rifle. "There's nothing friendly about bringing armed men to my home, Blackwood." Blackwood dismounted with fluid grace, adjusting his hat against the sun. His companions remained on horseback, hands resting casually near their weapons. Different Cloud sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Now, Carson. No need for hostilities." Blackwood gestured toward the cabin. "I've simply come to continue our conversation about your property." "We've had that conversation," John replied firmly. "My answer hasn't changed. This land isn't for sale." Martha had retreated to the doorway with Emma, but she hadn't gone inside. Something in Blackwood's manner made her reluctant to let John face him alone. "I understand your attachment to this place," Blackwood said, removing his gloves as he walked closer. "But you're being unreasonable. My offer is more than generous." "It's not about the money." "It's always about the money, Carson." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Everything has its price." John stepped forward, positioning himself between Blackwood and the porch where his family stood. "Not everything." The tension in the air thickened. Martha pulled Emma closer, feeling her daughter's rapid heartbeat against her side. "You know," Blackwood said, his tone conversational but with an undercurrent of menace, "this territory can be dangerous for a small family on their own. Indians, outlaws, all manner of accidents that can befall isolated homesteaders." "Is that a threat?" John's voice was deadly quiet. "Just an observation." Blackwood spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "Which is why I brought Different Cloud along today." He nodded toward the Lakota man. "He mentioned something interesting about your property that I thought you should know." Different Cloud remained silent, his dark eyes moving between the men. "There have been reports of a war party moving through this area," Blackwood continued. Apparently, they believe this land contains sacred burial grounds. They might not take kindly to a white family building here. Martha felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. She knew what Blackwood was doing, trying to frighten them into selling. The problem was, his tactics were working. The thought of Emma in danger made her stomach twist with fear. "We've had no trouble with the Lakota," John said. "We respect their traditions." Blackwood shrugged. "Times are changing. The peace is fragile." He glanced back at Different Cloud. "Isn't that right?" The Lakota man nodded slightly but offered no words. "I came to make you one final offer, Carson." Blackwood's voice hardened. 50% more than my last price. Enough for you to start over somewhere safer, somewhere with more opportunities for your daughter." At the mention of Emma, John's posture changed subtly. Martha saw his shoulders tense, his grip on the rifle tightening. "My family is not part of this negotiation," he said quietly. "Everything is part of the negotiation." Blackwood stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Your land or your daughter's safety. That's the choice before you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Martha bit back a cry, instinctively pulling Emma behind her. John moved with unexpected speed. In one fluid motion, he had closed the distance between himself and Blackwood, the hunting knife from his belt now pressed against the cattle baron's throat. "John!" Martha cried out. The two men on horseback immediately drew their weapons, but Blackwood raised a hand to stop them. "You've made a mistake, Blackwood," John said, his voice a low growl. "You can threaten me, you can threaten my land, but you do not threaten my family." Different Cloud watched the confrontation with impassive eyes, making no move to intervene. "Think carefully about what you're doing, Carson," Blackwood said, remarkably composed for a man with a blade at his throat. "This ends only one way." "You're right about that," John agreed. "It ends with you riding off my land and never coming back." Martha held Emma tightly, shielding the girl's eyes from the scene unfolding before them. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched her husband, the gentle, hard-working man who read to Emma by lamplight and sang old folk songs on winter evenings, holding a knife to another man's throat. "John," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "This isn't the way." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind rustling through the tall grass and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. Then, unexpectedly, Different Cloud spoke. His voice was quiet, but carried across the yard with surprising clarity. "The child has the spirit mark." All eyes turned to the Lakota man. "What?" Blackwood asked, confusion momentarily replacing his arrogance. Different Cloud nodded toward Emma, partially hidden behind her mother. "The mark on her arm. It is sacred to my people." Martha instinctively touched the birthmark on Emma's forearm, a small crescent-shaped mark that had been there since birth. "What are you talking about?" Blackwood demanded. "This land," Different Cloud continued, "is not burial ground, but it is protected. The child with the spirit mark cannot be harmed. It would bring great misfortune." John kept the knife at Blackwood's throat, but his eyes flickered toward the Lakota man, trying to determine if this was truth or strategy. "You never mentioned any spirit mark before," Blackwood said accusingly. Different Cloud met his gaze without flinching. "You never said you would threaten a child." The tension in the air shifted. Martha felt it, a subtle change in the balance of power. Blackwood's men looked uncertain, exchanging glances that suggested this development had altered their calculations. "Lower the knife, Carson," Blackwood said finally. "We can discuss this like civilized men." "There's nothing to discuss," John replied, but his grip on the knife loosened slightly. "You threatened my daughter. That ends any negotiation between us." "Perhaps I spoke hastily," Blackwood conceded, his eyes darting to Different Cloud and back. The safety of your family is, of course, paramount to everyone involved. Slowly, John stepped back, lowering the knife but keeping it ready in his hand. "Get off my land, Blackwood. Don't come back." The cattle baron adjusted his collar, his composure quickly returning. "This isn't over, Carson. One way or another, this land will be mine." "Not today," John said firmly, "and not tomorrow." Blackwood mounted his horse with as much dignity as he could muster. "Different cloud," he snapped. "We're leaving." The Lakota man made no immediate move to follow. Instead, he looked directly at Emma, still clutched in her mother's protective embrace. "The spirit mark brings protection," he said softly, "but also responsibility." Then he turned his horse and followed Blackwood and his men as they rode away from the homestead, dust swirling in their wake. As they disappeared from sight, Martha rushed to John's side, Emma still clinging to her skirts. "Are you all right?" she asked, reaching for him with trembling hands. John nodded, sheathing his knife. His face was pale beneath his tan, the reality of what had just happened, what he had almost done, sinking in. "What was that about Emma's birthmark?" he asked, kneeling down to his daughter's level. The girl looked up with wide, frightened eyes. "Am I special, Papa?" John gathered her into his arms, holding her close. "You've always been special, little one." Martha watched them, relief washing over her in waves. But beneath the relief was a current of unease. Blackwood would be back, she was certain of it. And next time he might not be deterred so easily. As if reading her thoughts, John looked up at her over Emma's head. "We need to be ready," he said quietly. Martha nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon where dust still marked the rider's departure. What did Different Cloud mean about responsibility? John shook his head. "I don't know, but I intend to find out." Emma pulled back from her father's embrace, her small face serious beyond her years. "Are the bad men coming back?" John and Martha exchanged a look, the same thought passing between them. How to protect their child in a world where men like Blackwood wielded such power. "If they do," John said finally, "we'll be ready for them." But as they walked back to the cabin together, the shadow of Blackwood's threat followed them like a storm cloud on the horizon, promising rough weather ahead. Night fell across the Carson homestead, bringing with it an uneasy quiet. Martha moved about the cabin, her movements mechanical as she prepared the evening meal. Her mind kept returning to the morning's confrontation, John with the knife at Blackwood's throat, the cold calculation in the cattle baron's eyes, and the strange intervention from Different Cloud. John sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. He hadn't spoken much since Blackwood and his men had ridden away, but Martha could read the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly drifted to the windows. Emma sat on her small bed in the corner, unusually subdued as she traced the crescent-shaped birthmark on her forearm. "Mama," she finally asked, breaking the silence, "what did the Indian man mean about my mark?" Martha exchanged a glance with John before setting down the pot she was holding. She crossed to Emma's side, sitting down beside her daughter. "I don't know exactly, sweetheart," she answered honestly. "Different Cloud seems to think it's special." "He called it a spirit mark," Emma said, her small fingers still outlining the pale crescent. "He said it protects me." John set the rifle aside and joined them, crouching down to Emma's level. "Do you remember Mr. Turner from town, the one who lost his arm in the war?" Emma nodded. "Well, he told me once that the Lakota believe certain marks on the body are gifts from the spirits, signs that a person has been chosen for something important." "Chosen for what?" Emma's eyes widened with childlike wonder. "That's what we need to find out," John said gently. Martha brushed a strand of blonde hair from her daughter's face. "Whatever it means, nothing changes for us. You're still our Emma." The little girl seemed to consider this, her expression thoughtful beyond her years. Is that why the bad man went away? Because of my mark? The bad man went away because your father stood up to him, Martha said firmly, not wanting her daughter to believe she was somehow responsible for their safety. And because Different Cloud helped us. But he'll be back, John added, his voice hardening. Blackwood isn't the type to give up easily. Martha shot him a warning look over Emma's head, but John shook his head slightly. He wouldn't lie to his daughter, not even to spare her fear. When he comes back, will you hurt him with your knife? Emma asked quietly. John's expression softened as he took his daughter's small hands in his. I don't want to hurt anyone, Em. I just want to protect our home, our family. But you were angry. You looked scary. John winced at her words, the truth in them cutting deeper than any blade could. Sometimes, he said carefully, when people we love are threatened, we do things we wouldn't normally do, but that doesn't make it right. Martha watched the exchange, her heart aching for both of them, for Emma's lost innocence and for John's burden of protection. Enough talk of bad men tonight, she interjected, standing up. Supper's nearly ready, and tomorrow will be a busy day. As Emma washed up for the meal, John pulled Martha aside near the hearth. I'm riding to the Lakota camp at first light, he said quietly. I need to speak with Different Cloud, understand what he knows. Martha's stomach tightened with anxiety. Is that wise? Going alone? I don't have a choice. If that birthmark really means something to them, we need to know what we're dealing with. And what about Blackwood? He could come back while you're gone. John's jaw clenched. Jeb Miller's place is just over the ridge. I'll ask him to keep an eye on things. John, Martha said, placing a hand on his arm. I've never seen you like that before. With the knife. He couldn't meet her eyes. I've never felt like that before. When he threatened Emma. He trailed off, struggling to find the words. It was like something broke loose inside me. You scared me, she admitted in a whisper. John looked up then, pain evident in his expression. I scared myself. Before Martha could respond, a knock at the door made them both freeze. John immediately moved to the rifle he'd left on the table, picking it up in one fluid motion. Martha gathered Emma close, pulling her behind the rough-hewn table. Who's there? John called, positioning himself between the door and his family. It's Different Cloud, came the reply, the voice unmistakable in its quiet dignity. John and Martha exchanged surprised glances. He approached the door cautiously, rifle ready, and opened it to find the Lakota man standing alone on their porch, unarmed. May I enter? Different Cloud asked simply. After a moment's hesitation, John stepped back, allowing him inside while keeping the rifle visible. Different Cloud nodded respectfully to Martha and Emma before turning to John. I come to warn you. Blackwood is not a man who forgets insults. That wasn't an insult, John replied tersely. That was a promise. Perhaps. The Lakota man's expression remained impassive. But he has sent riders to Fort Kearney. He has friends among the soldiers there. Martha felt a chill run through her. The fort was 3 days' ride away, which meant they had time, but not much. What's he planning? John asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. He tells them you threatened his life without provocation, that you are dangerous to other settlers. Different Cloud's dark eyes moved to Emma. He does not mention the child or his own threats. Of course he doesn't, Martha said bitterly, and they'll believe him because he's Silas Blackwood. Different Cloud nodded. His words carry weight with the white man's authorities. John lowered the rifle slightly, studying their unexpected visitor. Why are you helping us? You work for Blackwood. I track for him sometimes, Different Cloud corrected. I do not work for him. That doesn't answer my question. The Lakota man's gaze returned to Emma, who was watching him with open curiosity from behind her mother. The spirit mark is sacred to my people. The child who bears it must be protected. What does it mean? Martha asked, her arms still protectively around Emma's shoulders. This mark, why is it important? Different Cloud was silent for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Many winters ago, he finally began, my grandfather's grandfather had a vision. He saw a time when our people would face great suffering, when the buffalo would vanish and strange sicknesses would come. But he also saw hope, a child born with the mark of the crescent moon who would help bridge the world of the white man and our world. Emma touched her birthmark unconsciously. Since that time, our shamans have watched for this sign. There have been others born with similar marks, but none in the right place at the right time. His eyes met John's directly. Until now. That's why you spoke up today, John realized. Not just to help us, but because you believe Emma is this chosen one. Different Cloud inclined his head slightly. The spirits work in ways we cannot always understand. But yes, I believe your daughter carries an important destiny. She's just a child, Martha protested. She can't bridge worlds or fulfill prophecies. She's 8 years old. The mark does not demand action now, Different Cloud assured her, only that she be allowed to grow, to learn, to become who she is meant to be. John ran a hand through his hair, struggling to absorb this unexpected revelation. And Blackwood? What happens when he returns with soldiers? That is why I came tonight, Different Cloud said, to help you prepare. Prepare how? My people have lived with threats for many generations. We have learned ways to protect what matters without always fighting. Emma stepped forward suddenly, slipping from her mother's grasp. Will you teach us? She asked Different Cloud, her voice small but steady. The Lakota man regarded her solemnly for a long moment before a slight smile softened his weathered features. Yes, little one with the spirit mark, I will teach you. John and Martha exchanged a look, part uncertainty, part desperate hope. They were being offered help, but accepting it meant acknowledging that their daughter might indeed have some greater purpose that neither of them fully understood. We don't have much choice, John said quietly to Martha, not with Blackwood bringing soldiers. Martha nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Emma. What do we need to do? She asked Different Cloud. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the cabin walls. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, a lonely, haunting sound that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. First, Different Cloud said, you must understand what you are truly fighting for. It is not just the land, but what the land represents. As night deepened around the small cabin, the four of them gathered close to the hearth's warmth, beginning a conversation that would change the course of all their lives, and perhaps, if Different Cloud was right, many more beyond. Dawn broke over the Carson homestead with streaks of amber and gold painting the eastern sky. Different Cloud had remained through the night, sleeping in the small lean-to attached to the cabin, rather than returning to his own people. Now he sat cross-legged in the yard, facing the rising sun, his eyes closed in silent meditation. John watched him from the porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands against the morning chill. The events of the previous day still felt surreal. Blackwood's threats, his own violent response, and the revelation about Emma's birthmark. Part of him wanted to dismiss Different Cloud's talk of visions and destiny as superstition, but he couldn't deny the Lakota man had risked his standing with Blackwood to help them. Martha emerged from the cabin, her hair loosely braided for the day's work ahead. Is he still praying? She asked quietly, nodding toward their visitor. I think so, John replied. Been there since before sunrise. She leaned against the porch railing beside him. "Do you believe what he said about Emma's mark?" John sighed, taking a sip of his coffee before answering. "I don't know what to believe. But I do know Blackwood is a real threat, and Different Cloud seems to be our only ally right now." "Emma couldn't stop talking about him last night," Martha said. "She's convinced he's going to teach her Indian magic." Despite the gravity of their situation, John smiled slightly. "She's always had an active imagination." "It's more than that," Martha said, her expression serious. "She believes in this destiny Different Cloud talked about. I can see it in her eyes." Before John could respond, Emma herself burst from the cabin, her blonde hair flying behind her as she ran straight toward Different Cloud. Martha started forward in alarm, but John caught her arm. "Let her go," he said softly. "I think she's safe with him." They watched as their daughter approached the Lakota man, stopping a respectful distance away. Different Cloud opened his eyes, regarding her solemnly for a moment before motioning for her to sit beside him. Emma dropped to the ground, mimicking his cross-legged posture with childlike earnestness. "What do you think he's telling her?" Martha whispered. John shook his head. "I don't know, but we'll find out soon enough." After a brief conversation, Different Cloud rose fluidly to his feet, Emma following suit. They walked together toward the porch, the man's tall figure in stark contrast to the child's small one. "Your daughter has a good heart," Different Cloud said by way of greeting. "She listens well." Emma beamed at the praise. "Different Cloud says I need to learn the way of the earth first," she announced importantly, "before I can understand the way of the spirits." John and Martha exchanged a glance, uncertainty passing between them. "We have much to do before Blackwood returns," Different Cloud continued, his tone matter of fact. "The child should learn, but there are more immediate concerns." "The soldiers," John said grimly. Different Cloud nodded. "If they come, they will have papers, what you call a warrant. They will claim the right to take you away." "On what charges?" Martha asked, her voice rising with indignation. "Assault, most likely," John answered before Different Cloud could. "I did hold a knife to Blackwood's throat. Because he threatened our daughter." "That won't matter to the law," John said bitterly. "Not when Blackwood's the one making the accusation." Different Cloud's dark eyes regarded them steadily. "You cannot fight the soldiers directly. It would only confirm Blackwood's claims about you." "So what do we do?" John asked. "Run." The Lakota man shook his head. "Running is what Blackwood wants. It would leave your land undefended." "Then what option do we have?" Different Cloud's gaze swept across the homestead. The small cabin they had built with their own hands, the vegetable garden just beginning to yield its harvest, the corral where their 2 horses grazed peacefully. "This land," he said quietly, "why is it important to you?" The question caught John off guard. "It's our home," he replied simply. "And to Blackwood, why does he want it?" John frowned, considering. "Water rights, mostly. Our creek feeds into the river that runs through his grazing land. If he controlled this property, he could dam it up, divert it however he wanted." Different Cloud nodded as if this confirmed something. "So the true value is in the water, not the land itself." "I suppose that's right," John agreed, "though the soil's fertile enough." "Then perhaps," Different Cloud said carefully, "what must be protected is not the land but the water's path." Martha stepped forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you suggesting?" "If Blackwood seeks to control the water, then the water must be shown to have its own path, its own destiny." He looked meaningfully at Emma. "Just as the child has hers." Emma touched her birthmark, her expression solemn beyond her years. I don't understand, John admitted. The Lakota have faced many enemies who sought to take what was ours, Different Cloud explained. Sometimes fighting back only brought more soldiers, more death. We learned other ways to protect what mattered most. And one of those ways will help us against Blackwood? Martha asked skeptically. Perhaps. Different Cloud's expression revealed nothing. But first we must prepare for the soldiers' arrival. For the next several hours, Different Cloud guided them in concealing valuable possessions, creating hiding places for emergency supplies, and establishing signals they could use to communicate if separated. John was impressed by the practicality of these preparations. They weren't the actions of a mystic caught up in visions, but the careful planning of someone who had faced real threats before. By midday, Emma had been assigned her own special tasks, simple but important responsibilities that made her feel included rather than merely protected. Martha, initially resistant to Different Cloud's influence on her daughter, gradually relaxed as she saw how he treated Emma with respect, but never burdened her with adult fears. As John and Different Cloud worked to reinforce the cabin's back wall, John finally asked the question that had been bothering him since the previous day. Why did you really speak up when Blackwood threatened us? The truth. Different Cloud continued working for several moments before answering. I have seen what happens when men like Blackwood get what they want, he said finally. They take more, always more, until nothing remains for others. So it wasn't just about Emma's birthmark? The Lakota man's hand stilled. The spirit mark is real, he said firmly, but so is Blackwood's greed. Both truths exist together. Before John could press further, Emma's voice rang out from near the garden. Papa, Ryder's coming. John dropped the tools and moved quickly to the front of the cabin, Different Cloud close behind him. In the distance, a cloud of dust marked the approach of several horsemen, too many to be just Blackwood and his usual men. The soldiers, Different Cloud said quietly. They have come sooner than expected. Martha hurried from the chicken coop, her face pale with fear. What do we do? John instinctively reached for his rifle, but Different Cloud placed a restraining hand on his arm. That is what they expect, the Lakota man said. It is what Blackwood has told them you will do. I can't just stand here unarmed while they take me away, John protested. No, Different Cloud agreed, but perhaps you do not need to be here at all. What? The spirit cave, Different Cloud said urgently. It is not far. The soldiers will not search there. You want me to hide? John asked incredulously. Leave Martha and Emma to face them alone? Not alone, Different Cloud assured him. I will stay. Martha joined them, Emma clutching her skirts. John, he's right, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. If they arrest you, we lose everything. If you can stay free until we find a way to prove Blackwood's lies. John looked from his wife to his daughter to the approaching riders, torn between his instinct to stand his ground and the logic of Different Cloud's suggestion. Papa, Emma said suddenly, her small face serious. The mark will protect us. Different Cloud said so. The simple faith in her voice decided him. All right, he said quickly, but I won't go far. At the first sign of trouble, I'll be back. The cave has a view of the homestead, Different Cloud told him. You will see everything that happens. The riders were close enough now that John could make out the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers mixed with several men in civilian clothes. Blackwood's men, no doubt. Go, Martha urged, pressing a small bundle of food into his hands. We'll be fine. John pulled her close for a brief, fierce kiss, then knelt to embrace Emma. Be brave, he whispered to his daughter. I'll be watching over you. I know, Papa, she replied with absolute certainty. With a last look at his family, John slipped away toward the rocky outcropping behind the homestead, where Different Cloud had shown him the hidden entrance to the spirit cave. As he disappeared from sight, Martha squared her shoulders and turned to face the approaching riders, Emma at her side and Different Cloud standing a respectful distance behind them. The confrontation that had begun the previous day was entering a new phase, one that would test them all in ways they had never imagined. From his position in the spirit cave, John watched the riders approach his homestead. The narrow opening in the rock face provided a perfect vantage point, close enough to see clearly, yet far enough to remain hidden. His hands clenched into fists as the cavalry soldiers reined their horses to a stop in front of his cabin, where Martha and Emma stood waiting. Different Cloud had positioned himself slightly apart, his posture neutral but watchful. Silas Blackwood sat atop his black stallion in the center of the group, looking entirely too pleased with himself. Beside him rode a cavalry officer whose bearing and decorations marked him as someone of rank. 4 more soldiers and 2 of Blackwood's own men completed the party. "Mrs. Carson," the officer called out, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of courtesy that seemed at odds with their purpose. "I'm Captain James Thornton of the United States Cavalry. I'm looking for your husband, John Carson." Martha lifted her chin slightly. "May I ask why, Captain?" Thornton produced an official-looking document from inside his uniform jacket. "I have a warrant for his arrest on charges of assault and making threats against Mr. Blackwood's life." From his hiding place, John could see Blackwood's satisfied smirk, and it took every ounce of his self-control not to rush down there. But Different Cloud's warning echoed in his mind. That was exactly what Blackwood wanted, to provoke him into confirming the accusations. "My husband defended our family after Mr. Blackwood threatened our daughter," Martha replied, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "If anyone should be arrested, it's him." Blackwood leaned forward in his saddle. "A desperate lie from a desperate woman, Captain. I came here on legitimate business and was met with a knife to my throat." The captain's expression remained neutral. "Mrs. Carson, the law requires me to bring your husband in to face these charges. Where is he?" Martha's hand tightened on Emma's shoulder. "He's not here." "Not here?" Blackwood's voice rose with disbelief. "Convenient timing, wouldn't you say, Captain?" Thornton ignored him, keeping his attention on Martha. "When do you expect him back?" "I don't know," Martha replied steadily. "He left at first light to seek advice from the circuit judge about Mr. Blackwood's threats against our daughter." John's eyebrows rose at his wife's quick thinking. It was a plausible explanation, one that would be difficult for Blackwood to disprove, and that established their side of the story. Captain Thornton's gaze shifted to Emma, standing solemnly beside her mother, then to Different Cloud. "And you are?" "Different Cloud," the Lakota man replied simply. "I work sometimes for settlers." "He's a scout," one of Blackwood's men volunteered. "Works for the boss occasionally." "Is that right?" Thornton asked, addressing Different Cloud directly. "I guide. I track. I do not work for any one man." Blackwood's expression darkened at the subtle correction. "He's being evasive, Captain. I brought him here yesterday as a witness to Carson's assault on me." Different Cloud met Blackwood's glare impassively. "I saw a father protect his child from threats." A muscle twitched in Blackwood's jaw. "That's not what you're supposed to say." "I speak what I saw," Different Cloud replied, his calm dignity a stark contrast to Blackwood's growing agitation. Captain Thornton surveyed the scene thoughtfully. John could tell the officer wasn't a fool. He sensed there was more to the situation than Blackwood had told him. "Mrs. Carson, I'll need to search your property," Thornton said finally. "If your husband isn't here, we'll be on our way until we can locate him." "The warrant is for John Carson, not his home," Martha pointed out. "That's true," Thornton conceded. "But given the circumstances—" "The circumstances," Blackwood interrupted, "are that Carson is hiding somewhere on this property, and his wife is covering for him. Thornton gave Blackwood a look that suggested he didn't appreciate the interruption. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand your concern, but I'll conduct this investigation according to proper procedure." "Procedure?" Blackwood scoffed. "While you worry about procedure, a dangerous man is escaping justice." From his vantage point, John could see the subtle shift in the captain's demeanor, a stiffening of his posture, a narrowing of his eyes. Blackwood was overplaying his hand, revealing too much of his personal vendetta. "Mrs. Carson," Thornton said, dismounting his horse, "I'd like to speak with your daughter, if you don't mind." Martha hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Emma, the captain wants to ask you some questions. Will you answer him truthfully?" Emma nodded solemnly, her small face serious. Thornton approached and crouched down to her level, removing his hat. "Hello, Emma. That's a pretty name." "Thank you, sir," she replied politely. "I need to ask you about what happened yesterday when Mr. Blackwood came to visit. Can you tell me about that?" Emma glanced at her mother, who gave her an encouraging nod. "The bad man said Papa had to give him our land or something bad would happen to me," Emma said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Papa got very angry and told him to leave us alone." John felt a surge of pride at his daughter's courage, and a flicker of hope at the captain's frown. "She's confused," Blackwood interjected from his horse. No one threatened her. "I'm not confused," Emma responded with unexpected heat. "You said, your land or your daughter's safety. I remember because it scared me." Thornton rose slowly, his expression thoughtful as he replaced his hat. "Mr. Blackwood, you didn't mention any such conversation in your complaint." "Because it didn't happen that way," Blackwood insisted, but even John could hear the hollow note in his voice. "The child is repeating what her mother told her to say." Different Cloud stepped forward then, his movement drawing all eyes. "The child speaks truth. I heard these words also." "You're both lying," Blackwood snapped. "Captain, I demand you search this property for Carson immediately." Thornton regarded Blackwood coolly. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't take orders from civilians, and I don't appreciate being misled about the nature of this dispute." "Misled? I was assaulted. Carson held a knife to my throat. After you threatened his child, if these witnesses are to be believed." "They're lying," Blackwood repeated, his composure cracking. "All of them." The captain turned back to Martha. "Mrs. Carson, where exactly did your husband go to find this circuit judge?" Before Martha could answer, Emma gasped and pointed to her arm. The birthmark, her spirit mark, as Different Cloud called it, seemed to shimmer briefly in the sunlight, the crescent shape standing out vividly against her skin. "Look," she said with childlike wonder, "it's glowing." All eyes turned to the mark. John couldn't tell from his distance whether it truly glowed or if it was merely a trick of the light, but the effect on those present was immediate. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, and even Captain Thornton seemed taken aback. Different Cloud stepped closer to Emma, examining the mark with reverent attention. "The spirits are watching," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "They see who speaks truth and who speaks lies." It was superstition, of course, the kind of mystical talk that normally made John uncomfortable. But in that moment, watching the uncertainty spread across the soldiers' faces and the alarm in Blackwood's eyes, he found himself grateful for whatever advantage it might give his family. Blackwood recovered quickly, his expression hardening into contempt. "Captain, surely you're not going to be swayed by Indian mumbo-jumbo and a child's birthmark?" Thornton's gaze moved between Emma, Different Cloud, and Blackwood, his military training clearly at odds with the superstition that affected even his men. Finally, he seemed to come to a decision. "Mrs. Carson, I still need to search your property as a matter of procedure, but I can see there's more to this situation than I was led to believe." Martha nodded her consent, and Thornton dispatched 2 of his men to check the cabin and outbuildings. John pressed deeper into the shadows of the cave, though he knew they wouldn't search this far from the homestead. "What about Carson?" Blackwood demanded. "The warrant—" "Remains in effect," Thornton finished firmly. "When we locate Mr. Carson, he'll have the opportunity to present his side of the story to the proper authorities. But I'm beginning to think those authorities will be quite interested in hearing about your role in this matter as well, Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood's face flushed with anger. "Are you threatening me, Captain?" "Not at all. I'm simply doing my duty, thoroughly and impartially." Thornton's tone left no room for further argument. "My men will complete their search, and then we'll be on our way." John watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and trepidation. Thornton seemed fair-minded, but the warrant was still active, and Blackwood clearly wasn't going to give up so easily. As if confirming his thoughts, Blackwood leaned down from his horse to speak directly to Martha, his voice too low for John to hear, but his threatening posture unmistakable. Martha stood her ground, Emma clutched protectively at her side, as Different Cloud moved subtly closer to them both. The soldiers soon returned, reporting no sign of John Carson on the property. Captain Thornton nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "Mrs. Carson," he said formally, "please inform your husband that he's required to present himself to the authorities in Fort Kearny within the week. Failure to do so will result in more serious consequences." "I'll tell him when he returns," Martha promised. As the captain prepared to depart, Different Cloud spoke once more. "The water shows the truth," he said cryptically. "The path it takes cannot be changed by man's desires." Thornton regarded him with puzzlement, but Blackwood's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing with sudden suspicion. "What are you talking about, Indian?" he demanded. Different Cloud merely smiled faintly and said nothing more. As the riders departed, dust billowing behind them, John finally allowed himself to breathe more easily. The immediate danger had passed, but he knew this was far from over. Blackwood would return, and next time, he might not bother with the pretense of legal authority. Nightfall brought John back to the cabin, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. Martha flew into his arms the moment he stepped through the door, her relief palpable in the way she clung to him. Emma joined the embrace, her small arms wrapping around his waist. "You were right," Martha whispered. The captain wasn't fully convinced by Blackwood's story. "I saw," John replied, stroking her hair. "You were magnificent, both of you." He glanced over her shoulder at Different Cloud, who stood quietly by the hearth. "All of you." "The warrant is still active," Martha reminded him, pulling back to look at his face in the lamplight. "Captain Thornton expects you to turn yourself in at Fort Kearny within the week." John nodded grimly. "And if I don't, they'll come back in force, with a lot less patience." "You can't go," Emma said fiercely, her fingers digging into his shirt. "Blackwood will hurt you." "No one's going anywhere tonight," John assured her, smoothing a hand over her blonde hair. "We have time to figure this out." Different Cloud moved forward, his expression solemn. "Blackwood will not wait for the law to take its course. He will come again sooner than you think." "You heard something?" John asked sharply. "I know men like him," Different Cloud replied. "The captain's doubts have made him dangerous. Wounded pride is more deadly than wounded flesh." Martha guided Emma to her small bed in the corner. "It's late, sweetheart. Try to sleep now." "But I want to help," Emma protested, even as she yawned widely. "You will," Martha promised, "but first you need rest." As Martha tucked their daughter in, John turned to Different Cloud. "What did you mean earlier about the water showing the truth?" A faint smile touched the Lakota man's lips. "I planted a seed in Blackwood's mind. He seeks this land for the water it controls. He should see what that water truly means. I don't understand. You will. Different Cloud moved to the small table where they took their meals, gesturing for John to join him. Tomorrow, I will show you. They sat in silence as Martha finished settling Emma for the night. When she joined them at the table, her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes remained alert and determined. What happens now? She asked quietly. We have 3 paths before us, Different Cloud answered. You can surrender to the warrant, hoping the truth will protect you. He looked at John. You can flee, abandoning this place to save yourselves. His gaze encompassed them both. Or you can stand and fight, not with weapons, but with a deeper power. What deeper power? John asked skeptically. Instead of answering directly, Different Cloud turned to Martha. The child's birthmark. When did you first notice it? Martha's hand went unconsciously to her own forearm, mirroring the location of Emma's mark. The day she was born. The midwife said it was a blessing that moon children were special. Moon children, Different Cloud repeated thoughtfully. Yes, that is what my people would call her too. But what does it mean? John pressed. Why is it important to your people? Different Cloud was silent for a long moment, as if considering how much to reveal. The prophecy I spoke of, about the child with the crescent moon mark. It tells of one who will come at a time of great change, when the old ways and the new ways must find balance. Emma is just a little girl, Martha protested. How can she possibly be responsible for something so enormous? The mark does not give her a burden to carry now, Different Cloud assured her. It is a sign of what may come when she is ready. For now it offers protection, a reminder to my people, and perhaps to others, that some things are sacred beyond our understanding. John leaned back in his chair, struggling with the idea that his daughter might be part of some native prophecy. It seemed far-fetched, yet he couldn't deny that Different Cloud's mention of the mark had created a powerful moment during the confrontation with Blackwood and the soldiers. You said the water shows the truth, he said finally. What did you mean by that? Different Cloud's expression became more animated than John had yet seen it. Water has memory. It follows the path laid down by generations before it. When men try to change its course for selfish reasons, it eventually returns to its true way. That's just nature, John said, confused. How does that help us against Blackwood? Because Blackwood does not understand the water, only what he can take from it. Different Cloud leaned forward. Tomorrow I will show you what the creek on your land truly means, not just to you or to Blackwood, but to all who live in this valley. Martha reached across the table to take John's hand. I think we should listen to him, John. We don't have many options left. John nodded slowly. All right, tomorrow then. As Different Cloud prepared to retire to the lean-to for the night, Emma's voice called softly from her bed. Different Cloud, can I ask you something? The Lakota man moved to her bedside, crouching down to hear her whisper. My mark got warm today when the soldiers were here. Is that normal? Different Cloud glanced at John and Martha, who had both moved closer to hear this exchange. It is rare, he told Emma carefully, but not unknown. The spirits sometimes speak through such marks, especially in times of danger. What were they saying? Emma asked, her eyes wide. That you are protected, he answered simply, and that those who would harm you face a power greater than their own. Emma seemed to consider this, her small fingers tracing the crescent shape on her arm. Will it help keep Papa safe from the bad man? Different Cloud's gaze met John's over the child's head. If we honor what the mark represents, yes, it will help protect your whole family. After Emma finally drifted off to sleep, The adults retired as well. Martha and John to their bed, Different Cloud to the lean-to. But sleep eluded John. He lay awake, listening to Martha's steady breathing beside him, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. Was Different Cloud manipulating them for his own purposes? Or was he genuinely trying to help? And what of Emma's birthmark? Coincidence or something more? Just before dawn, John rose quietly and stepped outside. The eastern horizon was just beginning to lighten, the stars still visible overhead. To his surprise, Different Cloud was already awake, sitting on a flat rock near the creek that bisected their property. "You doubt," Different Cloud said without turning, somehow sensing John's approach. "Wouldn't you, in my position?" John replied, settling beside him on the rock. "Yes." The simple admission surprised John. Doubt is natural when the path ahead is unclear. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the creek's waters catch the first hints of dawn light. "This water," Different Cloud said finally, "where does it go after it leaves your land?" John considered the question. "It joins Serpent Creek about 2 miles south, then flows into the river that runs through Blackwood's grazing land. And before it reaches you, where does it come from?" "The foothills to the north, I suppose. I've never traced it all the way to its source." Different Cloud nodded as if this confirmed something important. "Today we will follow the water's path, both ways. Only then will you understand its true power." "Blackwood wants to dam it," John said. "Control it for his cattle during the dry season. And if he does, what happens to those downstream?" The question gave John pause. He had been so focused on protecting his own claim that he hadn't considered the broader implications of Blackwood's plans. They'd lose their water access, I suppose, at least partly. "Exactly." Different Cloud stood, stretching his tall frame. "When the sun is fully risen, we will begin our journey. The water will show us the way." As they walked back to the cabin, where smoke now rose from the chimney indicating Martha was awake and preparing breakfast, John felt a strange sense of anticipation. He still wasn't sure he believed in spirits or prophecies, but he was beginning to understand that Different Clouds saw connections where others saw only individual concerns. "One question," John said as they neared the cabin, "that bit about Emma's mark glowing yesterday, was that real or just a trick of the light?" Different Cloud paused, his dark eyes meeting John's directly. "What do you think?" "I think," John said carefully, "that whether it glowed or not, the effect was real enough. Even Captain Thornton seemed unsettled by it." A ghost of a smile touched Different Cloud's lips. "Sometimes the truth lies not in what happens, but in what people believe has happened." "That's not really an answer." "No," Different Cloud agreed, "but it is the beginning of understanding." Inside the cabin, Emma was already up and helping her mother with breakfast preparations. When she saw them enter, she ran to Different Cloud, tugging at his hand excitedly. "I had a dream about the water," she announced. "It was singing." The Lakota man crouched down to her level, his expression serious. "What song did it sing, little moonchild?" Emma's face scrunched in concentration. It didn't have words, but it was showing the way home. Different Cloud nodded as if this made perfect sense. "The water remembers its path. Today we will learn to listen to its song." Martha caught John's eye over their daughter's head, her expression a mixture of concern and hope. He gave her a reassuring nod, though his own doubts still lingered. Whatever lay ahead, Blackwood's schemes, the legal troubles, even the mystical significance of Emma's birthmark, they would face it together as a family. And for now, that would have to be enough. The morning sun had fully risen by the time they set out. John, Different Cloud, and Emma following the winding path of the creek that bisected the Carson property. Martha had stayed behind, reluctant at first to let Emma join them, But Different Cloud had insisted the child's presence was important. "She must learn to see with more than her eyes," he had said, in that quiet, authoritative way that somehow made even the strangest statements sound reasonable. Emma skipped ahead, her natural childish energy a stark contrast to the gravity of their situation. John watched her, marveling at her resilience. She had faced threats and confrontations that would have terrified most children, yet here she was, fascinated by butterflies and singing softly to herself. "Your daughter carries her strength lightly," Different Cloud observed, walking beside John. "That is a rare gift." "She's always been that way," John replied. "Even as a baby, she faced the world with curiosity instead of fear." They followed the creek northward, upstream toward its source in the foothills. The land grew steadily more rugged, the gentle rolling prairie giving way to rocky outcroppings and stands of pine and aspen. Emma collected interesting stones along the way, stuffing them into the small pouch Martha had given her. "The water grows stronger here," Different Cloud said after they had been walking for almost 2 hours. "Listen." John paused, hearing the increased rush and gurgle of the creek as it navigated a series of small rapids. "It's just picking up speed because of the incline," he said, the practical explanation coming automatically. Different Cloud shook his head. "Not just speed, voice. The water speaks more clearly when it runs over stone." Before John could respond, Emma called out from ahead, "Look, the creek splits here." They caught up to find her standing at a point where the waterway divided around a large boulder, creating 2 separate streams that rejoined several yards downstream. "See?" Emma said excitedly. "It's like the water is making a choice, but then it comes back together again." Different Cloud nodded approvingly. "You have good eyes, little moonchild." "It's not really making a choice," John felt compelled to point out. "Water follows the path of least resistance. It's just physics." "Is it?" Different Cloud crouched beside the fork in the stream. "Look closer." John knelt beside him, uncertain what he was supposed to see. The water flowed smoothly around both sides of the boulder, creating mirror image currents that swirled and danced before merging again. "One path is slightly easier," Different Cloud said, pointing to the right fork. "Less resistance, as you say, yet the water divides itself evenly between both paths." John frowned, noticing for the first time that the Lakota man was right. The water seemed to distribute itself equally between the 2 channels, despite one clearly offering an easier route. "That's unusual," he admitted. "Water remembers," Different Cloud said simply. "This division has meaning." Emma leaned over the water, her reflection shimmering in its surface. "It's like it's trying to be fair," she said, "sharing itself." John watched his daughter, struck by her intuitive understanding of what Different Cloud was trying to show them. Perhaps there was something to this connection the Lakota man claimed she had with natural forces. They continued upstream, the terrain growing steeper. Around midday, they reached a small plateau where the creek emerged from a series of underground springs, bubbling up from beneath the earth in several places before joining to form the single waterway that eventually passed through the Carson property. "The source," Different Cloud announced, gesturing to the springs. Emma ran forward eagerly, kneeling beside one of the bubbling pools. "It's so clear," she exclaimed. "And cold." John joined her, dipping his hand into the crystal water. It was indeed cold, refreshingly so after their long walk, and purer than any water he had ever seen. "These springs feed not just your creek," Different Cloud explained, "but 3 others that flow in different directions from this plateau. One east, one west, one south through your land." John looked around with new appreciation. "So this plateau is a watershed for the entire valley?" Different Cloud nodded. "Now you begin to understand. This is why Blackwood wants your land." It is not just about the water that crosses your property, but about controlling access to the source. The implications dawned on John with sudden clarity. If he dams my creek and then buys up other properties connected to these springs, he controls all the water for 20 miles in every direction. Different Cloud finished. Ranchers, farmers, my people's settlement to the east, all would depend on his goodwill for their survival. John sat back on his heels, stunned by the scope of Blackwood's ambition. That's why he's been so persistent. My land is just the first piece of a much larger plan. Yes, and why the spirits have marked your daughter as important. She stands between Blackwood and many innocent lives. Emma, who had been listening to this exchange with unusual attentiveness for an 8-year-old, touched her birthmark unconsciously. So it's not just about our home? No, little one, Different Cloud said gently. It is about many homes, many lives. They ate a simple lunch by the springs, bread and cheese Martha had packed for them, while Different Cloud explained how the waters from this plateau sustained not just human settlements but also the delicate balance of plants and animals throughout the valley. The old ones of my tribe have a saying, he told them. The water decides who may live and who must leave. Those who respect its path prosper. Those who try to possess it eventually lose everything. After they had rested, they began the journey back, this time following the creek downstream beyond the Carson property. The afternoon sun was warm on their backs as they walked, the creek a constant companion on their right side. A mile past the homestead, they encountered the first evidence of other settlers who depended on the creek, a simple irrigation channel dug by the Miller family to water their vegetable gardens. Another half-mile brought them to a small holding where an elderly couple, the Thompsons, had built a water wheel to grind their corn. 6 families at least, John noted as they continued, tallying those whose livelihoods depended directly on the creek. And that's not counting the wildlife. Different Cloud nodded. Now imagine all of them at Blackwood's mercy. They reached the confluence where their creek joined the larger Serpent Creek late in the afternoon. Here the water widened and deepened, creating a natural gathering place. To John's surprise, a small encampment of Lakota families was set up along the banks. My people, Different Cloud explained as curious eyes turned their way. This is a sacred place to us, where the waters join and gain strength before flowing to the river. John had known there was a native settlement somewhere in the region, but he had never visited it. The sudden realization of how closely their lives were intertwined, all dependent on the same watershed, gave him a new perspective on their predicament. A wizened old man approached them, his face deeply lined with age and wisdom. He spoke to Different Cloud in their native tongue, his gaze repeatedly shifting to Emma with obvious interest. Different Cloud responded respectfully, occasionally gesturing toward John and Emma. Finally, he turned to them. This is Sees Far, an elder of our tribe. He wishes to look at Emma's mark if you will permit it. John hesitated, protective instincts flaring, but Emma was already stepping forward, pulling up her sleeve to reveal the crescent-shaped birthmark. The old man bent close, examining it without touching her. After a moment, he straightened and spoke again to Different Cloud, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of confirmation. What did he say? John asked when they had finished their exchange. He says the mark is true, Different Cloud translated. The prophecy speaks of water and earth in balance. The child who bears the mark will help preserve this balance in a time of great change. Emma looked up at the old man with solemn eyes. How am I supposed to do that? I'm just a girl. Sees Far surprised them by responding in heavily accented but understandable English. Not how. Who? You already are who you must be. The cryptic answer seemed to satisfy Emma, though it left John more confused than ever. Before he could ask for clarification, a commotion arose from the far side of the encampment. A young Lakota man rode in at speed, calling out urgently. Different Cloud listened, his expression growing grave. "Blackwood's men," he translated for John. "They are at the Thompson place tearing down the water wheel. They claim Blackwood now owns the water rights to Serpent Creek." John's hand went instinctively to his belt, where his knife would normally hang. "That's impossible. He can't own the water." "He has papers," Different Cloud said grimly, "from the territorial government." Far spoke again, his voice strong despite his age, and the tribe began moving with purpose, gathering weapons, mounting horses. "What's happening?" John asked, alarmed. "The elders have called for protection of the water," Different Cloud explained, "not with violence, but with presence. We will gather at the confluence to defend the sacred waters." John looked down at Emma, torn between the desire to join this resistance and the need to keep his daughter safe. "I should get Emma back to Martha." Different Cloud nodded. "Yes, then return if you can. Tonight, the water will need all its defenders." As they hurried back toward the homestead, the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon, John felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. This was no longer just about his family's land, it was about an entire community, a way of life, a balance that extended far beyond his own concerns. And somehow, impossibly, his 8-year-old daughter with her crescent moon birthmark stood at the center of it all. Dusk painted the sky in shades of amber and violet as John and Emma hurried back to the homestead. Martha met them at the door, her face tight with worry. "What's happened?" she asked immediately, gathering Emma into her arms. "Jeb Miller rode by an hour ago, said there's trouble at the Thompsons' place." John nodded grimly. "Blackwood's men are tearing down their water wheel. He's claiming he owns the water rights to Serpent Creek." "How can he do that?" Different Cloud says he has papers from the territorial government. John moved to the fireplace, where his rifle hung on pegs above the mantel. "The Lakota are gathering at the confluence. Not to fight, but to show strength in numbers." Martha watched him check the rifle's action, her expression conflicted. "And you're joining them?" It wasn't a question, but John answered anyway. "I have to. This isn't just about our land anymore, Martha. If Blackwood gains control of the watershed, he'll have power over everyone in the valley. Farmers, ranchers, the Lakota settlement." Emma tugged at her mother's skirt. "We saw the water's birthplace, Mama. It makes 3 creeks that go to lots of people." Martha stroked her daughter's hair absently, her eyes never leaving John. "If you confront Blackwood directly, the warrant will be the least of your worries. He'll have cause to claim you're inciting violence." "I know." John slung the rifle over his shoulder. "But I can't stand by while he destroys everything we've built, everything everyone has built." A knock at the door startled them all. John motioned for Martha to take Emma to the back room while he approached cautiously, rifle ready. "Who's there?" he called through the closed door. "Captain Thornton," came the reply, unexpected and unwelcome. John hesitated, then opened the door to find the cavalry officer standing alone on his porch, his uniform dusty from the road. "Mr. Carson," Thornton said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "I thought I might find you at home, despite reports to the contrary." "Captain," John made no move to invite him in. "Have you come to arrest me?" Thornton glanced at the rifle on John's shoulder. "That depends on what you're planning to do with that weapon." "Protect my family," John replied simply. "Same as always." The captain's gaze moved past John to where Martha now stood in the doorway to the back room, Emma partially hidden behind her skirts. "Mrs. Carson," Thornton nodded respectfully. "I hope I'm not intruding on your evening meal." "What do you want, Captain?" John asked bluntly. Thornton returned his attention to John. "Information primarily. I've received conflicting reports about activities in this valley, and I find myself in the unusual position of not knowing who to believe. What kind of activities? Water rights disputes, property damage, threats of violence. Thornton's expression remained carefully neutral. Some say Blackwood is legally asserting his claims. Others claim he's using intimidation to steal what isn't his. John studied the captain's face, searching for some hint of his true purpose. And you came here because your name keeps coming up in every account, Thornton replied, and because I suspect you're the only one who might tell me the unvarnished truth. Martha stepped forward. Captain, please come in. We were about to have supper, and there's plenty to share. John shot her a questioning look, but she met his gaze steadily. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped aside to let Thornton enter. The captain removed his hat as he crossed the threshold. Thank you, ma'am. That's very kind. As Martha bustled about preparing an extra place at the table, John leaned his rifle in the corner, within reach but no longer in hand, a compromise between caution and hospitality. You mentioned property damage, he said as they settled at the table. What exactly have you heard? Thornton accepted a plate from Martha with a nod of thanks. That Blackwood's men dismantled the Thompson's water wheel this afternoon, that they're preventing access to Serpent Creek at 3 different points, and that both settlers and Lakota are gathering at the confluence, creating a potentially volatile situation. And what has Blackwood told you? John asked. That he's legally exercising his water rights, that he purchased them from the territorial government last month, giving him control of Serpent Creek and all its tributaries. Including our creek, Martha said quietly. Yes, Thornton confirmed. According to the papers I've seen, he would have the right to control all water flow through your property. Emma, who had been quietly eating her stew, looked up suddenly. But the water doesn't belong to anybody. Different Cloud says it belongs to itself. Thornton regarded her with surprise, clearly not expecting philosophical input from an 8-year-old. Different Cloud, the Lakota man who was here yesterday. John nodded. He's been helping us understand what Blackwood is really after. It's not just our land, it's control of the entire watershed. The springs that feed our creek also feed 2 others. If Blackwood controls the access points, he controls the water supply for the whole valley. Thornton finished, his expression thoughtful. That's a considerable amount of power. Power he'll use to force people off their land, Martha added. Once he controls the water, he can set whatever terms he wants. People will have no choice but to sell to him or watch their crops and livestock die of thirst. Thornton set down his spoon, his meal half finished. You realize I can't simply take your word on this. Blackwood has legal documents. Documents that were never properly announced or posted for public review, John interrupted. Ask anyone in the valley if they heard about water rights being sold before Blackwood suddenly claimed to own them. A contemplative silence fell over the table. Outside, the last light of day faded from the sky, leaving them in the warm glow of the oil lamps Martha had lit. The warrant for your arrest is still active, Mr. Carson, Thornton said finally. I can't simply ignore that fact. I understand, John replied. But right now, there are people gathering to protect their livelihoods from a man who's using legal trickery to steal what should belong to everyone. That seems more urgent than one man's alleged assault on another. Before Thornton could respond, Emma gasped softly, her eyes wide as she stared at her forearm. The crescent birthmark was glowing faintly in the dim light of the cabin, not a trick of sunlight this time, but a genuine luminescence that emanated from her skin. Mama, she whispered, it's doing it again. All eyes turned to the phenomenon. Even in the lamplight, there was no denying the subtle glow that outlined the crescent shape. Good Lord, Thornton murmured, his military composure momentarily shaken. Martha reached for Emma's arm, touching the mark gently. It's warm, she reported, bewilderment clear in her voice. John met Thornton's stunned gaze across the table. Now, do you understand why Different Cloud believes Emma is special? Why the Lakota are involved in this dispute? It's not just about land or water. It's about something they consider sacred. Thornton struggled visibly to reconcile the rational world of law and order with the inexplicable sight before him. I don't know what to make of this. A commotion outside interrupted the moment. Hoofbeats approaching at speed, followed by urgent calls. Carson, are you there? We need you at the confluence. John recognized Jeb Miller's voice and moved quickly to the door. The neighbor sat atop his lathered horse, his expression grim in the gathering darkness. What's happened? John demanded. Blackwood's brought in more men, Miller reported breathlessly. They're stringing barbed wire across the creek where it joins Serpent. Says nobody gets water access without his permission from now on. The Lakota are facing them down, but things are getting ugly. Different Cloud asked for you specifically. John turned back to the room, where Thornton had risen from the table, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his hip. This is exactly the kind of confrontation I was hoping to prevent, the captain said. Then come with me, John challenged. See for yourself what's happening. Judge with your own eyes who's in the right. Thornton hesitated, his gaze moving from John to Martha and Emma, the latter's arm still faintly glowing in the lamplight. Captain, Martha said urgently, whatever you believe about spirits or birthmarks, you know what kind of man Silas Blackwood is. You've seen how he operates. Please, help us stop him before people get hurt. The moment stretched, heavy with potential consequences. Finally, Thornton gave a curt nod. I'll come, he decided, not to take sides, but to maintain order. If laws are being broken by anyone, I need to witness it firsthand. John grabbed his rifle and turned to Martha. Bar the doors after we leave. If Blackwood's men come here, we'll be fine, she assured him, though fear shadowed her eyes. Emma's mark will protect us. Whether she truly believed that or was simply putting on a brave face for their daughter, John couldn't tell. Either way, he kissed them both quickly before following Thornton and Miller into the night. As they mounted up, John on his bay gelding, Thornton on his cavalry horse, the captain leaned over. I'm still not sure what I just saw in there, he admitted quietly, but I know a man defending his family when I see one. Whatever happens tonight, remember, I have a duty to uphold the law. And I have a duty to protect what's mine, John replied. Let's hope those two things don't have to conflict. With that, they spurred their horses toward the confluence, where water and conflict flowed together in the darkness. The moon had risen by the time John, Captain Thornton, and Jeb Miller reached the confluence, its silver light spilling across the water and illuminating the tense standoff. On one side stood Blackwood and his men, perhaps 15 in all, armed with rifles and pistols. They had already strung barbed wire across the narrowest part of Serpent Creek, the metal barbs gleaming wickedly in the moonlight. On the opposite bank gathered the Lakota from the nearby settlement, along with several families from the valley, the Thompsons, the Parkers, the Hendersons, and others whose livelihoods depended on the creek. Different Cloud stood at the center of this group, his tall figure unmistakable. Beside him, the elder called Sees Far raised his hands toward the moon, chanting softly in his native tongue. Blackwood's voice carried across the water, arrogant and dismissive. This is private property now. I've paid good money for these water rights, and I'm exercising my legal authority to control access. The water flows for all, Different Cloud responded, his calm voice a stark contrast to Blackwood's aggressive tone. It cannot be owned, only respected. Tell that to the territorial government, Blackwood sneered. I have the papers right here. He waved a document in the air. Legal and binding. Anyone who interferes is breaking the law. John, Thornton, and Miller reined in their horses at the edge of the clearing, taking in the scene. The tension in the air was palpable, a powder keg awaiting only a spark. "This could turn ugly fast," Thornton muttered. "Those Lakota may not have many firearms, but they outnumber Blackwood's men." "Different Cloud won't let them start a fight," John said, though he was less certain than he sounded. "He believes in peaceful resistance." "Peace only works when both sides want it," Miller observed grimly. They dismounted, tethering their horses to a nearby tree. As they approached the gathering, heads turned their way. John felt the weight of many eyes upon him, hopeful from the settlers and Lakota, hostile from Blackwood's men. Blackwood himself stiffened when he spotted them, his face darkening with anger. "Carson," he called out, "come to join the savages in their pointless stand? And you've brought the good captain too, how convenient." Captain Thornton stepped forward, his uniform lending him an authority that even Blackwood couldn't entirely dismiss. "Mr. Blackwood, I've come to assess the situation personally. There are reports of property damage and threats being made." "The only threats are coming from these people," Blackwood retorted, gesturing to the gathered Lakota and settlers. "They're interfering with my legal business operations." "By operations, you mean cutting off their water supply," John interjected, unable to contain his anger. Blackwood's smile was cold. "I'm not cutting off anything, Carson. I'm establishing a fair system of water rights. Those who recognize my ownership and pay a reasonable fee will have all the access they need." A murmur of outrage rose from the settlers. Old Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his weathered face indignant beneath his shock of white hair. "Pay for water that's been free since God made it," he demanded. "You tore down my wheel today, a wheel my father built 30 years ago." "Your wheel was diverting water that now belongs to me," Blackwood replied smoothly. "But I'm a reasonable man. We can discuss terms for reinstallation, provided you acknowledge my rights and pay the appropriate fees." Captain Thornton moved between the two groups, his posture neutral but authoritative. "Let me see these papers you keep referring to, Mr. Blackwood." With a triumphant smile, Blackwood handed over the document. Thornton studied it carefully in the moonlight, his expression unreadable. "This appears to be an order," he admitted finally, "signed by the Territorial Commissioner last month." John felt a sinking sensation in his gut. He had hoped Thornton might find some flaw, some technicality that would invalidate Blackwood's claim. "But," Thornton continued, surprising everyone, "there's a question of proper notification. Land and water rights transfers of this magnitude require public posting for 60 days before taking effect. Was that done, Mr. Blackwood?" Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "That's a mere formality, Captain. The papers are signed and sealed." "Formalities matter in law," Thornton replied evenly, "as do the rights of existing users. These people have established claims through years of use." "Prior claims that are superseded by my purchase," Blackwood insisted, though with less certainty than before. Different Cloud chose this moment to cross the shallow part of the creek, moving to stand beside John and Thornton. His presence seemed to shift the energy of the confrontation, drawing all eyes to him. "The paper speaks of ownership," he said, his voice carrying easily across the water. "But the water itself speaks of belonging. It belongs to the earth, to the sky, to all creatures who drink from it. It belongs to the future as much as to the present." Blackwood snorted derisively. "Save your Indian philosophy, Different Cloud. This is about progress, about bringing order and efficiency to resources that have been wasted for too long. Is it waste when the water nourishes the fields that feed families?" Different Cloud challenged. "Is it waste when it gives life to the animals that sustain us? Or is waste when one man hoards what should be shared by many?" John was struck by the Lakota man's eloquence, the simple wisdom that cut through Blackwood's pretensions of legality. He glanced at Thornton and saw the captain was listening intently, genuinely weighing different Cloud's words against Blackwood's claims. "The law is the law," Blackwood insisted, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "And I've paid good money for these rights." "The law also speaks of the common good," Thornton replied thoughtfully, "of reasonable use and preventing monopolies that harm communities." A flash of movement drew John's attention to the far bank. To his horror, he saw Martha approaching with Emma in tow. They were making their way through the gathered settlers toward the creek's edge. "Martha," he called out, alarm clear in his voice. "What are you doing here?" All eyes turned to the newcomers. Martha's face was set with determination as she guided Emma forward. "She insisted we come," Martha explained when they reached the water's edge. Setter Mark was calling her to the water. Emma broke free from her mother's grasp and waded into the shallow creek, seemingly oblivious to the tension around her. The water swirled around her ankles as she moved toward the center, where the two creeks joined. "Emma, come back," John called, preparing to go after her. Different Cloud caught his arm. "Wait," he said softly. "Watch." As Emma reached the exact point where the waters merged, she knelt down, her small hands dipping beneath the surface. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers as the water around her began to glow with a soft blue luminescence that matched the light now emanating strongly from her birthmark. "What in God's name?" Thornton whispered, his composure finally cracking. The glow spread outward from Emma's hands, following the current downstream and then, impossibly, upstream as well, illuminating the entire confluence with otherworldly light. In that radiance, the barbed wire Blackwood had strung across the creek looked ugly and out of place, a dark barrier against the flowing brilliance. "The water remembers," Different Cloud said, his voice filled with reverence. "It shows us its true path." One of Blackwood's men dropped his rifle, backing away from the creek in superstitious fear. Others followed suit, their faces pale in the eerie light. Blackwood himself stood frozen, his legal document hanging forgotten from his fingertips. "This is just some kind of trick," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Some Indian magic or—" "It's no trick," Seasfar called from across the water, his aged voice surprisingly strong. "It is the spirit of the water responding to the child who bears its mark. The prophecy fulfills itself before your eyes." Emma looked up, her face serene in the blue glow. "The water doesn't want to be stopped," she said simply. "It wants to be free." As if in response to her words, the current strengthened around the barbed wire, tugging at its moorings. With a series of sharp pings, the wire began to break free, post by post, until it was carried away downstream, rolling into a harmless tangle that washed up on the shore at Blackwood's feet. The silence that followed was profound. Even the night creatures seemed to hold their breath as the glow slowly faded, leaving only the silvery moonlight once more, dancing on the water's surface. Captain Thornton was the first to speak, his voice hushed with awe. "In all my years—" "Do you still think it's just a birthmark, Captain?" John asked quietly. Thornton shook his head slowly. "I don't know what I think anymore, but I know what I've seen." Blackwood seemed to recover some of his composure, though his face remained ashen. "This changes nothing legally," he insisted, waving the document. "A light show doesn't invalidate a government contract." "Perhaps not," Thornton replied, taking the paper from Blackwood's hand. "But it certainly raises questions that need answers. Questions about proper procedure, about prior rights, about the common good." He folded the document deliberately. "Until those questions are resolved, I cannot in good conscience allow you to prevent these people from accessing water they depend on for survival." Blackwood's face contorted with rage. "You're overstepping your authority, Captain." "Am I?" Thornton met his gaze steadily. Or am I upholding the deeper principles of law, protecting the vulnerable from the powerful, ensuring resources vital to all aren't monopolized by one? Emma had returned to Martha's side. The glow of her birthmark now faded to a faint shimmer. But something had changed. John could see it in the faces of everyone present. What had been a legal dispute, a power struggle, had transformed into something more profound. A question of right and wrong that transcended paper laws. Different Cloud nodded to John, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. The silent mountain man had changed everything indeed, by bringing them to this moment, this recognition. Dawn broke over the valley with tendrils of pink and gold stretching across the eastern sky. The confrontation at the confluence had dissolved in the wake of Emma's mysterious communion with the water, leaving Blackwood fuming, but temporarily powerless. Captain Thornton had ordered everyone to return to their homes, promising a full investigation into the water rights issue before any further action could be taken. Now, as morning light filtered through the windows of the Carson cabin, John sat at the table with Martha, Emma, Different Cloud, and Captain Thornton. The atmosphere was subdued, heavy with the weight of what they had all witnessed the night before. "I've sent a rider to Fort Kearny with a dispatch," Thornton said, breaking the silence. "I've requested clarification on the water rights sale and asked for a suspension of enforcement until proper investigation can be conducted." "Blackwood won't wait for legal clarification," John replied, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "He'll find another way to push his agenda." "Perhaps," Thornton acknowledged, "but he knows he's being watched now, and after last night." He glanced at Emma, who sat quietly tracing the outline of her birthmark with one finger. Well, his men seemed rather shaken by what they saw. Martha poured more coffee for everyone, her movements betraying her exhaustion. What did they see exactly? What did any of us see? It was the question that hung over all of them. The inexplicable luminescence of the water, its apparent response to Emma's touch, the way it had torn free from Blackwood's barbed wire as if exercising its own will. Different Cloud sipped his coffee before answering. The spirits of the water revealed themselves through the child. They showed their true path, their true nature, to flow freely, to nourish all, to resist containment. "That's one explanation," Thornton said carefully, though not one I could include in an official report. John studied his daughter, who seemed remarkably unaffected by the extraordinary role she had played. "Emma, do you remember what happened when you touched the water?" Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It was singing to me, like in my dream, but I could understand it this time. It was angry about the sharp wire and sad because people were fighting. And the glowing?" Martha prompted gently. "Did you make that happen?" "No," Emma shook her head. "The water did that itself. It wanted everyone to see its path, to remember that it belongs to everybody." John exchanged a glance with Thornton, who looked both skeptical and troubled by Emma's simple explanation. "Captain," John said quietly, "what happens now? With the warrant for my arrest?" Thornton set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Officially, it remains in effect until a judge dismisses it. Unofficially," he paused, weighing his words, "I believe there are extenuating circumstances that justify delaying its enforcement. Blackwood's testimony has been called into question by multiple witnesses, including myself. It wasn't a full reprieve, but it was more than John had dared hope for. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Thornton cautioned. "This situation is far from resolved. Blackwood has powerful connections in the territorial government. The same officials who sold him those water rights won't be pleased to have the sale questioned." Different Cloud, who had been mostly silent, leaned forward. "The paper law may support Blackwood, but the water has shown its own law. Those who witnessed last night will not forget. Superstition won't hold up in a territorial court," Thornton pointed out. Perhaps not, Different Cloud conceded, but it will hold in the hearts of the people. Already the story spreads, of the water that defied barriers, of the child with the moon mark who speaks with the spirits. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. John rose warily, hand moving instinctively toward his rifle before he checked himself. Martha placed a restraining hand on his arm as he passed. Opening the door, John was surprised to find Old Man Thompson standing on his porch, hat in hand. Behind him gathered at least a dozen other settlers from the valley, the Millers, the Parkers, the Hendersons, and more. "Morning, Carson," Thompson said, his weathered face solemn. "Hope we're not intruding, but we need to talk about what happened last night, about your girl and the water." John hesitated, then stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in, all of you, though I don't know if we have enough coffee to go around." As the settlers filed in, filling the small cabin to capacity, John noticed that many of them cast reverent glances toward Emma, who watched the proceedings with wide, curious eyes. Thompson removed his hat as he approached her, a gesture of respect that seemed to surprise even Martha. "Miss Emma," the old man said gently, "we all saw what you did at the creek last night. We've come to thank you." Emma looked up at him, confusion plain on her face. "I didn't do anything, Mr. Thompson. The water did it." Thompson nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Yes, but the water spoke through you, didn't it? And because of that, Blackwood couldn't take what rightfully belongs to all of us." Jeb Miller stepped forward. His normally taciturn expression softened with something like wonder. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the spirit of the waters, how in the old days it would show itself to those pure of heart. I always thought they were just tales to entertain children, but now..." Different Cloud watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction. John realized the Lakota man had anticipated this, how the events at the confluence would transform Emma in the eyes of the community, elevating her from simply a child with an unusual birthmark to something more significant. Captain Thornton observed it all with a mixture of bemusement and concern. When Thompson finally turned to address the room at large, the captain straightened, clearly bracing himself for whatever frontier justice might be proposed. "We've talked it over," Thompson announced, "all of us who depend on the creek. We want to form a water association, make it legal and binding that the water belongs to everyone who lives along its path. No one person can own it or control it." John blinked in surprise. It wasn't vigilante justice they were proposing, but a practical communal solution. "A cooperative arrangement," Thornton mused aloud. "That's actually a sensible approach." "We want you to lead it, Carson," Miller added. "You and your family stood up to Blackwood when the rest of us were still figuring out what hit us, and with your daughter's special connection to the water, it seems fitting." John looked to Martha, seeing his own mix of surprise and uncertainty reflected in her eyes. "I don't know what to say. I'm not a leader." "You already are," Thompson insisted, "whether you wanted to be or not, and we need someone who understands what's really at stake here." As John struggled to formulate a response, Emma slipped from her chair and moved to stand beside Different Cloud. The Lakota man placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, the gesture communicating both protection and pride. "The prophecy continues to unfold," he said quietly, his words intended for John and Martha, though others could hear them as well. "The child with the moon mark brings people together, helps them find a new way forward." Martha joined them, her face a complex mixture of maternal concern and growing acceptance of her daughter's unusual role. "She's still just a little girl," she murmured to Different Cloud. "She can't carry this responsibility alone." "She doesn't have to," he assured her. "Look around you. See how many now stand with her, with you." John surveyed the packed cabin, settlers who had been neighbors but not necessarily allies, now united by a common cause. Captain Thornton representing the law but clearly struggling to reconcile it with what he had witnessed. Different cloud, bridging worlds that had long been separate and often hostile. And at the center of it all, Emma. Still his little girl, yet somehow more than that now. A symbol perhaps, but also simply a child who had touched something ancient and powerful within the flowing waters of their valley. "If we form this association," John said finally, addressing the room, "it has to protect everyone's rights. Settlers, Lakota, everyone who depends on the water. And it has to be strong enough to stand against Blackwood and anyone else who tries to take control." Thompson nodded firmly. "That's exactly what we want. A way to make sure what happened last night, what your daughter showed us, isn't forgotten or ignored." Captain Thornton cleared his throat. "Such an association would need official recognition to have any legal standing. I can help with that. Present your case to the territorial authorities." "Why would you do that?" John asked, genuinely surprised by the offer. Thornton's gaze moved to Emma, then back to John. "Because I've seen enough to know that Blackwood's vision for this valley would destroy something valuable. Something I don't fully understand, perhaps, but something worth preserving nonetheless." Different Cloud nodded approvingly. "The water brings clarity to those who are willing to see." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, its light dancing on the creek that had become the center of their struggle. Through the open door, John could see Blackwood's men gathered at a distance, watching the cabin with evident unease. The battle wasn't over, far from it, but something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power. The weeks that followed brought changes to the valley that no one could have predicted. Word of what had happened at the confluence spread rapidly, the story growing with each telling until it seemed that Emma had parted the waters like Moses or commanded the creek to rise up against Blackwood's men. John listened to these exaggerations with a mixture of amusement and concern, knowing that the truth was extraordinary enough without embellishment. The Water Association took shape with surprising speed, guided by Captain Thornton's knowledge of territorial law and strengthened by the participation of nearly every family in the valley. Even the Lakota settlement, typically excluded from settler affairs, had representation through Different Cloud and two other respected members of the tribe. Today, 6 weeks after the confrontation at the confluence, the association was gathering for its first official meeting. John stood on his porch watching wagons and riders approach from all directions, converging on the open area near the creek where they had set up benches and tables. "Quite a turnout," Martha observed, coming to stand beside him. She looked more rested than she had in months, the constant worry about their future finally easing as their position in the valley grew more secure. "More than I expected," John admitted. "Looks like folks from 3 valleys over have come to see what we're building here." Emma darted out of the cabin to join them, her blonde hair gleaming in the sunlight. "Papa, Different Cloud is coming with the elders. I can see them on the ridge." Sure enough, a group of Lakota was approaching from the east, led by Different Cloud and Sees Far. The old man had taken a special interest in Emma, visiting regularly to teach her about what he called the water wisdom, traditional knowledge about the watershed and its importance to all living things. Martha straightened Emma's dress and smoothed her hair. "Remember what we talked about," she said quietly. "People will want to speak to you today, maybe even ask about your mark. You don't have to do or say anything that makes you uncomfortable." Emma nodded solemnly. "I know, Mama. Different Cloud says I'm still just a girl, even if I'm also a moon child." The term had become commonplace now, accepted as easily as any other fact about Emma. John marveled at how quickly the extraordinary could become ordinary when people opened themselves to new possibilities. They walked together to the meeting ground where Thornton was already organizing the proceedings. The captain had surprised everyone by requesting a permanent assignment to the region, stating in his official request that unique conditions in the valley require consistent oversight and understanding of local customs. "Carson," Thornton greeted them with a nod. "Mrs. Carson, Emma." He had abandoned some of his military formality in recent weeks, though his uniform remained impeccable. "Everything's ready. We're just waiting for everyone to arrive." "Any sign of Blackwood?" John asked, scanning the crowd. Thornton's expression darkened slightly. "Not yet, but his lawyer is here." He nodded toward a thin, weasel-faced man standing apart from the main gathering, notebook in hand. "Observing," he says. "Gathering information to fight us more likely," John muttered. "Let him," Martha said with unexpected fierceness. "We have nothing to hide." As the meeting time approached, people began taking seats on the rough benches. John noticed that a space had been left at the front, directly facing the creek. Different Cloud guided Emma to this spot, positioning her so that the water was clearly visible behind those addressing the gathering. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Emma, with her connection to the water spirits, provided a living reminder of what had brought them together. Thornton called the meeting to order, his authoritative voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. "Today marks the official formation of the Three Creeks Water Association," he announced. "A cooperative agreement among all who depend on the watershed for their livelihoods and lives." He outlined the basic principles they had agreed upon: shared access, responsible usage, collective decision-making about any major changes to water flow. As he spoke, John noticed a commotion at the edge of the gathering. Silas Blackwood had arrived, flanked by 4 of his men. The cattle baron looked diminished somehow, his arrogance tempered by recent setbacks. The territorial governor, responding to the outcry from the valley and Captain Thornton's detailed report, had suspended Blackwood's water rights pending further investigation. Blackwood took a position near his lawyer, his face a mask of cold calculation as he surveyed the proceedings. When his gaze fell on Emma, a flash of something like fear crossed his features before he quickly composed himself. "The legal foundation of our association is this charter," Thornton continued, holding up a document. "Once signed, it will be registered with the territorial government, establishing our collective rights to the watershed." John was called forward to sign first, as the elected president of the association. As he dipped the pen in ink, a sharp voice cut through the murmur of approval. "This is illegal appropriation of legally purchased rights," Blackwood declared, stepping forward. "My claim to these waters was properly registered and paid for." A tense silence fell over the gathering. John paused, pen hovering over the document. "Your claim is under investigation," Thornton reminded him coolly. "And regardless of the outcome, this association establishes the prior rights of these families, rights that predate any purchase you may have made." "Rights based on what?" Blackwood demanded. "Squatters' claims and Indian superstition?" Different Cloud rose from his seat, his tall figure commanding immediate attention. "Rights based on understanding what the water truly is, not property to be bought and sold, but life itself, flowing through all of us." Blackwood sneered. "Save your poetry for the reservation, Indian. This is about legal ownership." "Is it?" The question came from Emma, her clear child's voice startling in the charged atmosphere. All eyes turned to her as she stood, her small figure somehow holding its own against Blackwood's imposing presence. "The water showed everyone what it wanted," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "It doesn't want to be owned, it wants to be shared." Blackwood's face flushed with anger. "I don't take instruction from children or superstitious displays." "Then perhaps you'll take it from this," Thornton interjected, producing an official-looking document from his jacket. "A ruling from the territorial court delivered by courier this morning. It invalidates your water rights purchase on grounds of improper procedure and failure to consider existing claims." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Blackwood snatched the paper, his face contorting as he scanned its contents. "This is temporary," he insisted, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "My lawyers will appeal." "Of course they will," Thornton agreed calmly. "And while that process takes its course, likely years, the association's charter will be in full effect, establishing a precedent that will be difficult to overturn." Blackwood's gaze swept the gathering, measuring the unified opposition he faced. These were no longer isolated homesteaders he could intimidate individually, but a community bound together by shared purpose and extraordinary experience. His eyes came to rest on John. "This isn't over, Carson." John met his gaze steadily. "No, I don't suppose it is. But the terms have changed, Blackwood. It's not just me you're fighting anymore." As if to emphasize his point, Emma stepped forward to stand beside her father. Behind her, Different Cloud and Seasfar moved to flank them, followed by Martha, Thornton, and then, one by one, representatives from each family in the valley. Blackwood took an involuntary step back, confronted by this living embodiment of the unity his tactics had inadvertently created. "Your land or your daughter," he had threatened that day that now seemed so long ago. He had never imagined that both would become the catalyst for something beyond his power to control. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, his men following like shadows. His lawyer lingered just long enough to make a few more notes before hurrying after his employer. A collective breath seemed to release from the gathering. Thornton returned to the charter, and the signing resumed, each name adding strength to their shared claim on the waters that sustained them all. As John watched the proceedings, Emma slipped her small hand into his. "The water's happy now," she said simply. He looked down at his daughter, this child with her mysterious connection to forces he still didn't fully understand. "How can you tell?" She pointed to the creek, where the midday sun cast dancing patterns of light across its surface. "Can't you hear it singing?" And for a moment, in the hushed aftermath of confrontation, with the community gathered in unprecedented unity, John thought perhaps he could, not with his ears, but with something deeper, something that had awakened in him through all they had experienced. Different Cloud approached them, his expression serene. "The prophecy does not end here," he said quietly. "The child with the moon mark has begun her journey, and the waters have shown their true nature. But there is more to come as she grows." "Will Blackwood return?" Martha asked, joining them with concern still etched in her features. "Perhaps," Different Cloud acknowledged. "Men like him do not surrender power easily, but he will never again face only one family standing alone." John looked out over the gathering, settlers in Lakota side by side, Captain Thornton bridging the gap between frontier justice and territorial law, Emma at the center of it all, with her birthmark now a symbol of protection rather than vulnerability. "Your land or your daughter," Blackwood had demanded, believing he could force an impossible choice. Instead, that threat had transformed both the land and the daughter into something more powerful than he could have imagined. A community united by water and wonder, bound together by a story that would be told for generations to come. As the charter passed from hand to hand, gathering signatures and strength with each name, John felt a peace settle over him that went beyond the immediate victory. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, guided by the wisdom of the silent mountain man who had changed everything and the daughter whose mysterious mark had shown them the way.